In a few weeks, I'll be presenting at a conference at my university on process panpsychism. I don't think I'll record the presentation because it'll be in French, and most of my audience here on YouTube is English speaking, of course. But I thought that I could at least do a dry run of the presentation and record it in English so I could post it on my channel. So here it goes. As I said, the presentation is on process panpsychism. So this is the sort of panpsychism that was put forth maybe most preeminently by Henry Bergson and Alfred North Whitehead, and which was later developed by other thinkers. This fits today in the broad conversation in philosophy of mind, where panpsychism has become a very popular position. And the trajectory of my presentation will be working progressively towards process panpsychism, using first panpsychism. So I'll just start off by explaining some of the reasons why panpsychism is all the rage right now in philosophy of mind. Then I'll explain what further steps process panpsychism takes, which most mainstream panpsychist theories don't take, and I'll explain why the process moves are useful, why they avoid what is called the combination problem for typical panpsychist theories. So without further ado, let's get started. Why is panpsychism popular as a theory right now? Well, first off, panpsychism states that consciousness is ubiquitous in the world. And it doesn't mean that, for instance, the table here is conscious. It means that at some level, like the level of fundamental particles, the table is conscious. And then the way the consciousnesses of those fundamental particles combine doesn't give rise to consciousness in the table, for instance, but the way, on the other hand, that my particles combine their consciousnesses, then you end up with my consciousness, JP, which indeed exists, doesn't just cancel out like it does in the table. Okay, and further, another thing that is worth defining, when I'm talking about consciousness here, I'm talking about the phenomenal side of consciousness. To take Thomas Nagel's famous expression, that is what it's like to feel something. So what it's like to see this blue, for instance, what it's like to taste an apple, what it's like to feel this pain or this emotion in general. So it's what it's like to see or to feel something. Okay, and as I said, this theory, this panpsychist theory, that this sort of phenomenal consciousness is, exists in humans, but also in our cells, in our molecules, atoms, and particles. This panpsychist theory is becoming more and more widespread in philosophy of mind because it avoids seemingly most of the big issues and also in a very elegant way. Okay, so there are lots of issues in philosophy of mind for the moment. The biggest one maybe is called the problem of consciousness, and that is the broad question of it doesn't look like phenomenal consciousness can be somehow reduced or identified or even just fit in the worldview we get from physical science. Because physical science teaches us, for instance, that, okay, I am a certain set of particles following some laws, and it looks like we can explain everything this way. I am, the way my particles are configured, you could, in principle, calculate that it will cause my lips to move this way, my chest to move that way, and so on, so that I will say these words. It doesn't look like we actually need to bring in experience, phenomenal consciousness, or anything like that in that story. And there are lots of thought experiments to dive deeper into this if you're interested. David Chalmers, for instance, has defended very powerfully the argument that you could conceive of zombies, of people who are particle for particle identical to us, but which lack consciousness, in the same way that typical materialists would say that, well, I mean, fundamental particles aren't conscious, obviously, and most people would say this. But I mean, if you take lots of fundamental particles which are unconscious, and if you combine them together into a human, well, then you get an unconscious human, just like the fundamental particles were unconscious. So this is sort of the zombie arguments, and there are others. I'm not going to go through them today. I'm instead going to explain why panpsychism can insert consciousness so nicely into that story. And it comes down to an observation made by, maybe most famously by Bertrand Russell a bit over 100 years ago now, I think, that actually, if you look at the physical story I just told you, it's actually empty. Physical science doesn't tell us what is the nature of things. It tells us how things behave, but it doesn't tell us about their nature. It tells us about equations, but doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations. Let's take the time to think about this carefully. What does physical science tell us about electrons, for instance? Well, it tells us that electrons follow certain laws. So it tells us the behavior of electrons, but doesn't tell us what the electron really is. Even when physical science tells us that the electron has this mass or that charge, really all that this amounts to is a description of what will happen to the electron if you put this mass in that equation or this charge in that equation there. So even saying that a certain particle has this mass or this charge doesn't even tell us what is the nature of that thing. It just tells us how it behaves. And that's the same thing for all of the entities in physics. And I should right away put aside an objection which you may think of. Well, I mean, maybe physical science doesn't tell us what the nature of electrons is right now, but maybe one day we'll learn that electrons are made of particles X and Y. And then we'll know the nature of electrons. But that doesn't work. It actually just pushes the problem one level further down by, by the same token, we can just say, well, then physical science still doesn't tell us what is the nature of X and Y. It tells us, I mean, what are the equations which describe the behavior of X's and Y's, but it doesn't tell us really what they are, and by the same token, doesn't tell us what electrons are still. Okay, and the panpsychist move here is to say that, well, physical science gives us an ontology that has sort of lots of holes in it. It has lots of voids. It tells us how a human being behaves, but doesn't tell us what a human being is. It tells us how, let's say, a molecule behaves, but doesn't tell us what a molecule is, doesn't tell us what a quark is, just tells us how the quark behaves. So we need to notice one thing, that actually, even though physical science isn't the place to look to know what is the intrinsic nature of, let's say, a human, we have introspective access to this. I mean, a good candidate for the intrinsic nature of humans is their consciousness. Because let's say I get up to go grab a coffee. Presumably one day, physicists could tell us that, okay, well, this set of particles follows these laws, which mean that JP will get up and do this. But that, as I said, this is an empty explanation. It tells us my behavior in terms of the behavior of more simple particles, but it's just an explanation of behavior in terms of behavior. It doesn't tell us really what is the nature, what is the deep cause of that me getting up and go grabbing some coffee. But we do have access to the real nature there, the real cause there. It's my consciousness, my desire to go and get up and grab a coffee. So for the hole that is left in physics, we have a good candidate. We can take our consciousness and put it in the hole left by physics. And the idea in panpsychism is to do this not only at the level of humans, but do this at all the levels of our ontology. So in the same way that I fill the ontological void of physics by putting my consciousness in the description of my whole organism, I can put a certain consciousness, of course much simpler, in my cells, and I can put a simpler consciousness in my molecule still, and so on. So ultimately, the real nature of electrons is a certain consciousness, of course very simple, which explains, for instance, why they desire to get closer to protons and to get away from other electrons, and so on. So this is the basic panpsychist move, and it's extremely elegant. It gives us an answer to the mind-body problem. It gives us a place for consciousness in physical ontology, while at the same time solving the problem of the ontological void of physical entities. Okay, so this is the main reason why panpsychism is all the rage right now. And as I said, process panpsychism will differ from this mainstream view of panpsychism. And one thing to note is that if we just stopped there at this point, we would face what is called the combination problem for panpsychism, and that is the main problem for panpsychism right now in philosophy of mind. And that is the very good question of, okay, well, let's say that my cells, for instance, are conscious, and that somehow my consciousness is a combination of those. Well, I mean, is it really a combination of those? How is it that different consciousnesses can even combine? It doesn't look like when, let's say, I'm talking with people, does my consciousness really combine with others? I mean, we don't generally see this, and it doesn't feel like my consciousness is a combination of, cellular consciousnesses. My consciousness just looks like a fairly coherent whole, or so the story goes. So most panpsychists today are working on this problem, on the problem of how it is that different consciousnesses can combine. Okay, and the move which process panpsychists will make is to go a step further, looking into the ontology of physics. Okay, so because we already said that, let's say, the particles, the atoms, and so on are only described intrinsically. They're only described in their behavior by physical science and not in their intrinsic nature. The further move is to say the same thing about space and time. Okay, and this is a move which, for instance, Henry Bergson made over 100 years ago now. And he put it in provocative ways. Well, there has to be something that has some nature that explains why it is that entities that are separated in space can interact together. For instance, why is it that the Earth and the Moon can interact gravitationally together? I mean, there has to be something doing the work there. They're separated, so something has to be doing the work. And physical science tells us that space is involved in there, but I mean, for space to actually do that work, space needs to have some nature. But of course, physical science doesn't tell us what is that nature. It tells us how physical science behaves, how it interacts with different objects, with gravitational waves and photons and so on, but doesn't tell us what space actually is. And Bergson said the same thing about time. I mean, physical science can tell us what time looks like if you plug it into that equation or this equation or that equation, but doesn't tell us why time flows. Why doesn't time just fly all at once? Why does our sense of time sometimes shrink and sometimes expands? Why is it that time flows at a certain speed? Why is it that chemical reactions take a certain time instead of just going by in an instant? There has to be some nature to time which explain this. And there are, interestingly, some analytic philosophers who are making this point, although they're not going as far as the process panpsychist. I can think of Philip Goff, for instance, who says, much in the same way that Bergson was, that, well, I mean, today, from relativistic physics, we know that space and time are pretty much interchangeable with space. With matter and energy. So just like matter and energy need to have some intrinsic nature, space and time also need to have some intrinsic nature. And physical science, again, doesn't tell us what that intrinsic nature is. Okay, so now that we agree that space-time needs to have some intrinsic nature, which explains how different entities can interact in space-time, the question is, what is our best candidate for the intrinsic nature of space-time? Okay, and interestingly, Goff at this point will say that this is not something we can answer because we have no idea on the phenomenal side of things what it's like for conscious entities to combine together in space and time. Because recall, the first move in panpsychism was to identify the intrinsic nature of physical objects with consciousnesses. The further move is to identify space and time with something that has to do on the phenomenal side. And there is no good candidate for this, generally acknowledged in the literature and philosophy of mind. But process panpsychists did claim that we do have some introspective access to the way consciousnesses can combine or fragment. And Bergson talked about it in terms of condensation and fragmentation, and this had a lot to do with choice, with how potential can be constrained. And Whitehead put this in a nice ontological hierarchy, in the same way that if you look at the ground level of physics, it looks like there's just potential there. There are like fields of probabilities from which different particles can emerge. And the way that Whitehead understood this was that, well, those different fields are potential, and there can be some conscious choice there, which will turn that potential into particles. And so you see very simple consciousnesses there of particles which decide to appear or not. Then from the different particles, there can be a choice made, which will combine all the different, from the potential combinations of those particles, what kind of atoms they will make. Then again, from the atoms have the potential to combine into lots of different things, lots of different molecules, but there will be a conscious choice there, of course very simple, which will combine them into those molecules or that molecule. And ultimately with humans, that is the same thing which occurs. We can tell that actually we do sometimes combine our subconsciousnesses when we're making choices, and that when we're not making choices, our consciousness can actually fragment and does the opposite. Something which Bergson and Whitehead both talked about. Bergson claimed that we can really observe this if we just try to do nothing and observe what will occur to our consciousness, and we will be able to tell that it will spread out in space, and that it will shrink in time, and that it will fragment into smaller sub-consciousnesses. You can do this if you're meditating. You'll see that in my normal consciousness, for instance, I can think a few seconds ahead. I have an idea of what I'm going to say in the next few words, and my consciousness is also spatially quite constrained into, let's say, looking just at a part of the screen, actually, maybe something very as small as my thumb. Maybe I don't really feel the chair in my back or whatever noises are going on outside and so on. I'm very constrained spatially, and I'm extended temporally. And my consciousness is very unified into just thinking what I'm going to say in the next few seconds. But if I try to do nothing, I can instantly tell that my consciousness will fragment in space, that I will start to feel things in let's say, like the chair in my back. I will start to feel like the rug on my foot. I'll start maybe to feel my glasses over there. I'll start to maybe smell something, and so on. I can tell that my consciousness will spread spatially, and further, all of those different sensations are very short temporally. I'm not thinking a few seconds ahead as I am when I'm talking. I'm just sort of feeling that in my foot right now, that in my back right now, and so on. And those are all somehow coexisting, and I can somehow shift around them and let them fragment into different aspects of my personality. And on the other hand, when I choose to combine that, when I choose to do things instead, when I choose to, let's say, speak these words, I can tell that my consciousness will sort of gather. I will cut away a bunch of stuff and take some other stuff to put it together into the sentences I'm saying. And this will be the basic candidate for the intrinsic nature of space-time in process panpsychism. It's the way that potential that is spread in different entities can interact, can come together under one, which will gather them up from space and extend them in time. So this is, of course, all still open to very much empirical investigations, but this is the basic insight of process panpsychism. You not only say that the intrinsic nature of physical objects is conscious, because this allows us to solve the mind-body problem very well. You also say that the intrinsic nature of space-time is the relation of fragmentation and condensations of consciousnesses. because it allows you to solve the problem of the combination of consciousnesses at the same time as filling the ontological void of physical science regarding spacetime. All right, so this was a pretty quick introduction to process panpsychism, and of course there's a lot more literature on this, and there would be a lot more to say, but I hope that was enough to pique your interest, and I would encourage you to look at other videos on panpsychism on my channel, and also maybe the best place if you want to read about process panpsychism, I would say would be Milic Capek's book titled Bergson and Modern Physics, a Reinterpretation and Reevaluation. That's a really clear book about process panpsychism, and I really enjoyed reading it. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation and you found it useful. Thanks for listening, guys.